I guess I'd just like to say thank you all very much for coming, and particularly I'd like to thank Nobel Prize winner Douglass North for coming here to join us this week. I'd like to thank John for chairing the conversation that we'll be having today. And my thought in doing this and organising this on behalf of Mercatus and the Social Change Project was just to give you guys a sort of a informal way to get to know Professor North's work and his life, actually, because he's been doing this for quite a long time now and clearly had quite an impact on to Doug, and look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. Well, good morning, Douglas. Good morning to all of you. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Douglas. Let me just tell people what the ground rules are. I figure, just so you know, what Douglas and I will chat, or rather, I will get into chat for about an hour or so, and then we'll take a short break. We'll grab a drink, a 2 minutes breather, and we'll come back, talk a little bit more, and then open up the floor for questions. Okay? Does that sound good? So, welcome.
I do want to point out that I've never been in a discussion with him where I did all the talking. He talked as much as I did. But don't let him kid you.
So, Douglas, the obvious first question to ask is for you to tell us about institutions. You're associated with work on the economics institutions, and you've made institutions a big part of the economics profession. So tell us about your ideas and how they've evolved over the years.
How long do you want me to do? Because it's a long discussion.
Well, why don't you start by telling us what you mean by them and why you think they're important?
The institution is the way human beings structure human interaction. And of course, I came at it because I was dissatisfied with the fact that economics, and indeed the social sciences generally, except sociology, I'll come back to that, really didn't talk about that. It seemed to me that that was going to be a crucial part of our understanding, and that didn't start out to be, because if you're a good economist, you started out with good neoclassical modeling, and neoclassical models don't have any institutions in them. And also, they don't particularly have the other social sciences, political science, sociology, and so on. So, it was a long road. I should start really in the beginning and point out that when I was your age, at Berkeley, I was a Marxist. And I was a Marxist for a very good reason, namely the economics that I got as an undergraduate at Berkeley. It seemed to me in the middle of the Great Depression, long before any of you were born, it didn't have anything to say about any of those things. It was, and you asked yourself, how could we be having a Great Depression when it made no sense in terms of the theory we had? And so I got quite dissatisfied with this. And there was Marx and Marxism and Leninism that talked about all kinds of every interesting problem there was. It talked about depression, so it talked about ideology, talked about belief systems, and talked about all the things that it seems to me economics ought to be talking about. It talked about political theory, social theory. It had a good Marxist has a theory about anything, aesthetics, you name it, so they got it. Well, for somebody who was, going through college, your age, why, this was very appealing, and so I became a good Marxist, and was a Marxist then when World War II came along, and I joined the Merchant Marine because I didn't want to kill anybody, so that seemed like an easy way to get around. All I did was get shot at, but I didn't shoot at anybody else. And so when at the end of the war came, I had to decide what I was going to do. I also was a photographer then, and I had to debate whether I was going to continue being a photographer, because I worked for the Farm Security Administration in 1941, photographing migrants in the Central Valley of California for a summer. And I had to decide what I was going to do, and it was a tough decision. Finally, I decided to go back and become an economist. But what I got at that time was neoclassical economics, and I particularly got a colleague at my first job, University of Washington, who was a good neoclassical economist named Don Gordon, and Don taught me economics, neoclassical economics. And so I moved from becoming a Marxist to becoming a very good neoclassical economist. And I then played a fairly significant role in convincing economic historians that economic theory was important and econometrics was important, even though I had no econometrics because it didn't exist at this time. And so I attempted to reshape economic history to use theory and statistical methods, which we did. That's called the Cliometric Revolution. And it was an enormous success. So the first book I wrote was Economic Growth of the United States, 1790 to 1860. And it was a good neoclassical book. It pointed out it was a market economy, and it was. And the way market economy evolved was the whole story. But after that, I decided to switch and go into European economic history. And when I got there, there wasn't, how do you explain economic history when there wasn't any markets? Or markets were a tiny part of what went on. And you were trying to explain particularly economic change and the way in which it evolved through time. And it seemed to me that economics had nothing to say about all that. And it's at that point that I asked myself, well, how do human beings try to structure the game so that they would focus on creating efficient markets? And that obviously was a big story because it required you have a social theory about how societies work, you had to have a political theory about how polities work, and you had to have an economic theory, and you had to tie them all together. Something we still are a long ways from doing perfectly. Well, what it led to was my trying to develop a framework that made sense out of it, and that's when I began to ask myself about institutions. But institutions you can't deal with it without getting both into sociology and the political science, because institutions concern themselves not only with informal structure of human economic activity, which is what sociology, but also with formal political theory, and then economic theory. So all of this was at the beginning of my working my way through institutions, which I'm still doing, but which has come a long way. I mean, it's now become a accepted field. When I looked around at the time that I did it, well, there was Ronald Coase was writing about things like that, but nobody else particularly was at that point. Well, there'd been Veblen a lot earlier who written about it, but it hadn't really developed any degree. So anyway, that's why I started. How long do you want me to go? Or
I'm going to ask you a couple of things. Like, for instance, in that time period, particularly the early neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, in some sense, ruled out institutions as being very important. So how do you see the fact that in the 60s, particularly the 50s and 60s, the notion was that institutions were at best a secondary issue with respect to the economy? That is, one argument you could make is that the whole trend in the profession from the 30s through the 60s was the belief that the dominant issues with respect to growth had to do with capital accumulation and technology transfer, and that in some sense institutions were of minor importance.
What it missed was transaction costs, though, and it turned out that that's a big number. And as soon as you ask yourself, why does it take resources to be able to structure the game in the way you want it? You've got to ask yourself, what are the impediments that make it so that it is costly for societies to evolve themselves, politically and socially and economically. And indeed, when you look at national income accounting now, about half of it goes to transaction costs. And so this took a long time to evolve. You just didn't start out saying transaction costs. But when I first got to know Ronald Coase, it was very interesting because he and I both got honorary degrees at the University of Cologne in 1958, something like that, or maybe 68. 68,
68, I think.
Yeah. And Ronald got up, and we both had to give talks. And Ronald got up and gave a talk about his view about institutions and so on. And his view was all within the context of qualifications for economic theory, but he had never thought about the larger context in which once you had transaction costs and institutions, they were a big name, then you got to ask yourself how the society worked and why society didn't work well. And so I got up after that and gave a talk saying, this is what the implications of Ronald's theory are for the way in which we ought to think about how societies evolve. And that turned out to be as much of a surprise for Ronald as it was for everybody else in the room. He had never thought about that way. So this began the long road then of trying to work out exactly what they are, how they work, why they work the way they do. And it required both integrating political theory, because you got a theory about political institution, you have to have economic theory about how they interact with the economy, and you have to have a social theory about the informal structure of norms and so on that underlies the informal structures of society. So all of that.
But how did it work? Because I remember even quite some time after that, when I was going to graduate school, that there were a lot of people who still believed it was all a matter of just transferring technology. So how did you respond to people who sort of talked about growth as if it were purely a matter of planning or of getting the right capital-labor ratio? Indeed, I remember there was a volume from the 1950s of the NBER in economic growth in which a whole bunch of distinguished contributors looked at economic growth in various countries, from the Soviet Union, from the United States and France, and I noticed that in the entire volume, there was almost no discussion of legal or institutional issues. And people talked about, say, problems of growth in the Soviet Union and problems of growth in England as if they were the same fundamental problem. The terms were always in terms of, well, so-and-so didn't have enough aggregate demand, or the labor supply was doing this. And it was all very macro discussion. And
well, but you left something out, which is Rostow and the whole story about technological change. Because when I was a graduate student, you broke up economic history into two periods, pre the Industrial Revolution and post-Industrial Revolution. And that was it. I mean, and nobody paid much attention to pre-industrial because before the Industrial Revolution, societies were all primitive and they didn't count. And so you could ignore them or you could give a footnote to them. But as soon as you asked a different question, you know, how did you get societies to change like that? You know, you had to ask what the hell is going on for the first 10,000 years, and that began to ask questions that were embarrassing. I got involved in this because I, early on, attacked Walt Rostow's takeoff theory of economic growth. You probably never even heard of it. Have they heard of Rostow?
most haven't, I'm sure.
Well, Rostow, when I was a little older than you are now, was the big name in economic history, and for good reason. He attempted to say, well, the reason the Industrial Revolution was the key, and the takeoff occurred by leading sectors in the economy, for reasons that never were quite clear, suddenly expanding because of demand, and that led them into industrializing and the whole takeoff. So that it wasn't just the macro part of it, because economic history at that time was semi-autonomous from neoclassical theory. And indeed, neoclassical economists didn't pay much attention to it. And then when the Cleometric Revolution came in, neoclassical economists loved it because it was an attempt to integrate economic theory and economic history together. Not altogether satisfactorily because of the reasons that I hinted at earlier, which is that you couldn't figure out how societies worked when they, and why development wasn't automatic. So you had to go back before the Industrial Revolution and answer a whole series of questions that up to that time really not been significant amount of work.
I wonder, one of your favorite papers, at least one of your papers I like the most, is the 67 one in the Journal of Political Economy on the productivity of ocean shipping. I tell people it's sort of, I forget the exact title, it's the productivity of ocean shipping, something like it's the highest ratio of quality to boringness of title of any paper I've ever seen. But
that's good from him.
but it was remarkable because on the face of it, it looked like a standard neoclassical paper estimating the sources of changes in productivity of ocean shipping. But the punchline of the paper was unusual. The punchline was that technology was not the main determinant of the fall in the price of the cost of shipping across the Atlantic. The major issue was the changes in property rights having to do with security of the sea lanes, right?
Well, piracy's back in our
Exactly.
in the headlines today, but piracy disappeared for a long time and we didn't talk about it. But it was essentially, when you looked at productivity change and you got the numbers and you ask yourself, what was explaining the fall in the cost of shipping? You couldn't find technological change being a big part of it. It's true the steam engine came along, but the steamship really didn't significantly affect productivity in shipping until the latter half of the 19th century. And so you had this long period when shipping was becoming vastly more productive without an explanation. Then it became clear that what you were doing was, first of all, you were eliminating piracy, and when you eliminated piracy, you eliminated most of the crew that you had on earlier ships, which were gunners and people equipped with that. And also ships had to be built much more heavily so that they could withstand the recoil of big cannons and on and on. So when you eliminated piracy and ships could then do nothing but carry freight or passengers, you suddenly got enormous falls in productivity. Now, that wasn't the only reason, because also market expansion led to better markets, so the turnaround time in ships and things like that. But the heart of the productivity of ocean shipping was that technological change was there, but it wasn't a big part of it.
Now, in hindsight, it seems to me that paper was in some sense a precursor to your institutional work. I don't know how it affected your thinking, right?
Because then I had to ask myself, how well do we explain all that in terms of the economics we have to understand economic systems, the way economies evolved, and it wasn't a part of it. And so then you said, well, what's missing? Well, this began to get the fact that you had a big number that was missing, which was institutions' transaction costs, which underlie institutions and the way they evolve.
So, but it seems to me that as you were making these insights, you still have a world in which the feeling was, well, if you turn the right levers and knobs, everything will be okay. We'll get economic growth. And obviously places like the World Bank and the IMF were spending money, particularly in the developing world, in an attempt to operationalize raw stuff. The idea is if you got enough capital and if you gave them technology, you gave them the right machines, you gave them enough money, you give them some know-how, eventually they'll get economic growth. In fact, people said to me all the time, they said, yeah, if you get the prices right, or if you fix institutions, you'll affect statically the allocation of resources. But technology gets you dynamic increases in gains, and technological improvement overrides mistakes of institutions. People said that all the time. Indeed, that was the justification for huge amounts of policy for things like import substitution, the protection of car industries, et cetera, et cetera. Now, to what extent do you think people would have been as receptive to your institutional ideas had there not been the stagflation and the problems of the economy in the late 60s and early 70s, particularly the 70s, right, when stagflation really starts to take off?
I don't think stagflation was a major. It certainly
You don't think so?
Accelerated, I think, change, but I think that it was, it was an intellectual change in which, as we dug more into the sources of productivity change, and we had to take into account the fact that transaction costs, which in the earliest measure, I did a study for the National Income Accounting Institute, and that was in the 1970s, I guess, and we came out with the fact that transaction costs were 25% of GNP in 1870 and 45% of GNP in 1970. And now there was, a big number that we had no explanation for in terms of standard economic theory. And you had to say, what's missing? Well, institutions are what's missing, because institutions clearly were a key to what determined transaction costs. And then you had to start to ask questions that you hadn't asked before. But I've never thought about it in terms of your phrasing it the way you just did. What do you think?
Well, one of the things I really think that there was such a huge sea change. If you look at the 40s and the 50s, even up to the early 60s, something like Coase was derided for not believing in planning, right? And your work was almost the antithesis of, say, a lot of the Samuelsonian viewpoint. So Paul Samuelson is extremely famous for his work on mathematical economic theory, for which we still respect him. But his policy ideas about the importance of government planning and the sort of almost the equivalence in which he treated sometimes policies in the East Bloc and the West were almost the opposite of the kinds of things you were talking
Well,
about.
I think we have to bring something else into it, which is we have Malthusian, because I think that one of the things that also hung on here for a long time, and it's got a resurrection in Alms, as you well know.
Yes, yes.
Have they all read Alms?
Farewell to Alms. Well, they've heard about Greg Clark's work, but I'm not sure.
Well, we'll come back to that maybe. But when we started, Malthus was still a major figure in understanding the world, because we've talked about technology, we haven't talked about population change and its influence. And so once you brought that in, then you got to ask yourself, how did we escape the population crisis or the Malthusian crisis, which what's called hadn't got us out of until very recently, but that's it.
We'll get
Yeah.
to that.
But when you put them together, then you had a lot of things missing from the tools that we should think about if we're going to be good economic historians. You have to have a theory of demography. You do have to have a theory of technology behind that, the way the stock of knowledge grows, and still left out of it, you got to have a theory about how human beings take advantage of these things or don't take advantage, because what we haven't talked about is the fact that still 3/4 of the world still is not very highly developed. And why aren't they? I mean, if the technology is really available and the stock of knowledge behind it is not a problem, then why isn't all the world developed? And so then you begin to ask a set of questions that, while they take into account demography and take into account growth in the stock of knowledge, I've got to ask why still in the world today we don't have development all over the world. And that's
Well, maybe this is a good place to take a break and come back to some of these ideas. But let's focus instead on, let's jump from this to your recent work. So you asked, right now we've discussed your intellectual history a little bit, and we'll talk some more about that. But I thought, now is a good time to jump in and you tell us a little bit about your current views about why the world's not developed. Particularly, this might be a good place to introduce your ideas with Wallace and Weingast that you're going to discuss in your new book on violence and social orders.
well, I don't know quite where to begin.
Well, I guess let's put it this way. You've talked about institutions and you've sort of said, well, obviously Rostow and so forth don't really explain why the world isn't developed. So, and in your new book, you do have a kind of story. You have a story about why the whole world isn't developed. So why don't you talk about that? So why isn't the whole world developed? And how is that related to some of your recent work? Why isn't the whole world developed?
Well, what our new book does is makes a powerful argument for why you won't develop. Because one of the things that bugged me for years when I got interested in institutions and got interested in the growth and the stock of knowledge, all the kinds of things we just talked about, is it seemed to me that this should happen automatically. I mean, why would the world just evolve? And indeed, a lot of implicit and sometimes explicit stories about economic growth are stage theories in which, and this is what Rostow was doing as a part of it, in which you'll gradually evolve more complex structures over time, and it's automatic. Well, we've had a lot of time now to watch this non-automatic not work, and so you had to begin to ask yourself that something must make it so that there are fundamental impediments to economic growth. And what the new book tries to do is to ask what kind of a structure has existed throughout history since we created agriculture in 8000 BC. What kind of a structure is it, and why is it tend to be self-perpetuating and not evolve into the competitive modern economy that we see in Western Europe and the United States? And that's what this new book is about. It's an attempt to explain what we call the natural state, which is a political, economic, social system that tends to perpetuate itself, and even though it may be violent and fall apart, when it reconstructs it again along the same lines. and getting one that reconstructs itself along the lines of what we view as a modern economy, a competitive political, economic, social system of democracy, and all those is not inevitable, and it doesn't follow out of this. And that's what this book attempts to deal with, is ask why the natural state, or what we call limited access societies, is natural, and why it perpetuates itself, and what the doorstep conditions are of the few societies, and it's only about 15 to 20% of the world's population now, that have evolved into what we call open access societies, which are competitive and generally democratic societies. That's where we're going.
Well, so in many ways, and this is quite relevant for the GNU audience, your story is really one about how difficult it is in practice to get a liberal order. That is, a classical liberal order is very difficult. It may well be unstable under most historical conditions. That in fact, the problem of obtaining both the conditions under which people can trade freely while still maintaining order is so difficult that many societies will prefer to have an illiberal economic regime in order to produce a stable one, at least to limit elites from killing each other.
Right, and that's where the title of our book came from. We'd been writing this book together, or fighting with each other about writing this book, I should say. And we didn't have a title. And gradually, very gradually, we came to perceive that it is the potential for disorder is so great in all through history that creating a structure that would be stable and not have disorder or violence was a crucial part of it. So out of it came the first half of the title of our book, Violence. The second half of the title, Social Orders, is that we think about all of history as really being only three social orders. One, a foraging society, which is hunting and gathering, which is only, well, except for the Amazon basin or a few other places, it doesn't exist anymore. But there's really just two that still exist today, of which one is the limited access society or natural state, and the other is open access society. And what we had to do is ask what are the mixture of political, social, economic structure that has provided for such stability in the limited access society, and why don't you tend to evolve into an open access society? And that's what the book's all about.
I'll tweet you on this in public. I'll remind you that I was the one who first suggested focusing on violence way back in the early days. You thought I was insane.
I thought you were insane, that's right. He reminds me of these things all the time.
But to push it a little bit further, for this audience, is there an implication in your book, or are you simply agnostic, that the modern liberal state, to the extent that it exists even imperfectly in the West, is that stable, or is that an aberration?
Oh no, I think that's the big question of the world today. I have no overall confidence that open access society, even when you get it, is stable.
Because I can play devil's advocate, right? So let me sort of say, imagine I were a fan of older orders. I could sort of say, well, but judged by the span of human history, this modern stuff is great for a while. It leads to sort of growth and success for a couple hundred years, but it breaks down. It gets crises which consume themselves, and in the end, you're going to get very high growth, but you're going to have the economy or you're going to have the society splinter apart. And aren't we better off having slower growth but greater stability over a longer period of time?
You want to have me give you a one-sentence answer to that question?
You get 2 sentences, maybe.
2 sentences. 2 sentences or only one. I don't know the answer to that. No, I think that is we are obviously evolving. One of the things that is where I part company with economics, standard economics, is that it's all based on equilibrium theory, and that's a lot of apple butter, if you'll pardon my favorite expression. If you really want to understand economic history is a process of evolving, not evolving necessarily in the Darwinian sense that we're progressing, but evolving in the sense it's changing in ways that have no parallel with anything that ever existed before. Can I use my proper word now? It's a non-ergodic world. Thank you. And nobody's going to say, what the hell is that?
Well, you just did. So now tell us.
I do not think that there's any deep underlying theory about how economies work that makes any sense. Now, don't misunderstand me. I think neoclassical price theory is an elegant body of theory which I use every day. And indeed, lots of pieces of neoclassical theory are enormously valuable and a great contribution. But they're not a dynamic process, and they don't tell you how, as you evolve, how you get from one to the other. And if you want to see an illustration of it, you want to see the world we're in today and the crisis we have today. The crisis we have today is one in which the institutional structure has so changed that it's clear to me, not necessarily to Larry Summers, but clear to me that old tools are going to be inadequate to deal with it. Because we didn't have derivatives that make difference. We didn't have pyramiding of financial structure like we have today. And we've created a world that's new. It's not good. And what we have, the theory we have that dealt not even adequately then, but dealt at least with the Great Depression or with crises that existed, let's say, in 1980s and 90s, but clearly is inadequate to deal with the theory today. You're going to, of course, have a problem, a solution to that problem, aren't you?
I'm going to ask you something slightly different, which is to sort of say, even if we acknowledge, which I think many people are doing, that a lot of our theories are flawed, what I seem to be seeing is something in which there's a grab bag. It seems like there's this non sequitur, that because many of the highfalutin theories have failed or don't seem to have done much to predict the crisis, some people are using that as an excuse to say fall back to the simple-minded Keynesianism, or to many of the ideas from the 30s and 40s, or other kinds of ideas. Who knows? That is to sort of say one set of theories has failed is not in some sense a warrant for any sort of other theory to be true. But you're seeing this kind of pushback.
It could very well be that older theories really may make more sense than it did, but I doubt that. I think that you've got to ask yourself a lot of questions about the institutional framework today and what makes it work and not work, and how is it working? We don't know that. I mean, one of the things that's missing is, and including all of us institutionalists like me, is we have not evolved a dynamic theory about institutional change, or even attempted to evolve dynamic theory, and we have to do that if we're going to play the kind of role that I think we ought to be playing in improving how societies work over time. And I don't think we're anywhere near it.
So this is something that bothers me. What if people's response to this is sort of say, well, I don't want to think about institutions. I just want to know what works. And something doesn't really have to work literally. They just simply have to feel that certain actions make things better or for worse. It could be cargo cult science, it could be witch doctoring. But the point is people want action. And people will get an action and they will come up with a theory after the fact.
Have we talked about adaptive efficiency yet?
Please do.
Okay. By adaptive efficiency, and I wrote about this, not this book, but the last book, Process of Economic Change. By adaptive efficiency, you mean that if you really is a non-ergodic world, so you keep evolving new and novel ways that human beings structure human interaction, political, social, and economic, then clearly the theory you had that worked yesterday may work tomorrow. But if you evolve far enough, it's going to not work tomorrow. And so you're going to be stuck. And we have been, for the last 100 years, we've been changing radically. The economy of the Constitution didn't look anything like the economy of 1890s or anything like the economy of 1990s. How did we get along with it? Well, what we did, and it was not done deliberately in the case of the United States, but what we did was we had an institutional structure that encouraged experimentation, encouraged people to try out different things. And also, most important, not only encouraged people to try them out, but also encouraged elimination of failures, bankruptcy laws and things like that. That's as important as providing inducements for people to try experiments. And why? Because every time you create an institutional framework, even if if it's a failure, it has winners and losers. And the winners are people who are going to capture rents from it the way it's done. And they're going to try to perpetuate it. And so what they'll do is once you created the institution, they'll try to get the political moxie to perpetuate that institution, even if it doesn't work. But it'll work for them. So you have an ongoing dilemma. And this is the reason why the process of economic change is never a surefire thing. You can never be sure that you can keep evolving frameworks, and you're going to encourage experimentation and the elimination of failures all continually all through history. And I'm not sure we will all through history. My favorite story about this is Argentina, which I know a fair amount about because I was an advisor to the government down there over a number of years. And one of the things about Argentina was that they were the sixth highest income country in the world in 1940. And then the next 40 years they fell back to third world status, real third world status. That stagnated for 40 years. Then a guy named Menem came in, and he encouraged innovation. He tied the peso to the dollar, and I provided some talks with him over time. And he broke out of the recession, and looked like they were going to go back on the high road to open access. Well, they did for a little while, but one day he asked me to come down, and when I came down, he said, "Doug," he said, I've got a problem I want to talk to you about." He said, "I'm going to run for re-election, and I want to change the way the game is played." And I said, "You can't." I said, "Because there's a term limit, and your term's up next year." "Oh," he said, "that's not a problem." He said, "I'll just change the rules." And I said, "Well, you got a court still, don't you know?" He said, "I'll just pack the courts." He did both. Well, what I said to him at the time, I'm glad I said it, and I got out of the room before he arrested me, was I said, if you do that, you're going to perpetuate the very thing that has made all Latin American societies, I didn't use the word limited access, and I didn't have it at that time, but fall back into failure. Because you cannot have that kind of degree of freedom to be able to do what you want. You've got to have some limits on what you can do, and you've got to evolve in ways that's moving you in the other direction. And that's what happened to them since then. They're perpetuating third world status again.
Well, let's ask how these ideas of yours, to move it to ask sort of what kinds of ideas can be developed in this institutional mode. How do these ideas of yours, John's and Barry's, tie into the other institutionalists? So for instance, would you say that, say, Ollie Williamson, whose work is on hierarchy and organization, is helping us understand the nuts and bolts of incentives in organizations that sort of parallel this? Or like, how does your work complement or support or argue against the other work that, say, developed along the coastlines? You talked about transactions costs, but there's a whole literature on transactions costs, which seems to take off in a very different direction, go off in a different direction from your work.
I think everybody else is wrong.
What
does he want me to say? No, I think there's a lot of interesting, and let me reverse that. I think that we know so little about the whole way by which institutions, particularly political institutions, evolve, and which is at the heart of what we want to do, that we've got to learn. We have no body of political theory that's, you have good political scientists around here, it's a crappy field. And quite literally, because there's no body of theory that tells you how political systems work and why they work the way they do. And so that we're a half-baked thing. So a lot of the interesting work, the most interesting work I think in the future is going to be in developing a more sophisticated body of politics. I think Ollie's stuff is okay, but it's why are you giving me that? When he gives me expressions like this, you know, I know we think that's apple butter.
Well, what about Mansur, say? So how does your work, say, tie into late Mansur Olson's work on interest groups and the way in which interest groups?
Mansur Olson was certainly on the right track in many respects. although he did have one view, which is that you had to have a revolution every 20 years in order to, he had a right point, that in order to prevent vested interests from strangling the thing. Now the idea was right, in fact it's just a very important idea, which is there's a perpetual effort always for no matter what the group is, including college professors particularly, everybody wants a monopoly. And college professors are the worst of any of them. And you will too if you become a college professor. But what you want to do is you want to prevent monopolies from perpetuating themselves. And one of the things that we have done in America, sort of halfway, is we've evolved an institutional framework that tends to limit the political power of interest groups. Now, not completely, I've witnessed the agricultural groups and all kinds of groups, but we've done it well enough so that we have had a dynamic society for a long time. Whether that's going to continue is, I think, one of the most interesting issues in the world today. And one that I have no great confidence that we're going to do, because we still don't know enough about it. But Mansur's view that they automatically would occur without a revolution every 20 or 30 years turned out to be wrong, because what we did, and I hate to give him the credit because he's really a sort of a lousy economist and a lot of, but the view of you know, oh, I can't think of his name.
What would he do?
Well, what he did was that he had countervailing power. You know.
Oh, you mean Galbraith?
Yeah, Galbraith.
Okay.
But Galbraith wasn't a very good economist. But his idea of countervailing power turns out to be the way, is a part of the dynamic process of the way in which an open access society has perpetuated itself. Because the heart of an open access society is you've got to have competition in both political and economic markets for the obvious reason. If you don't have competition in both of them, you're going to have groups that will perpetuate rents and monopoly for themselves and strangle the economy, just as Mansur worried.
Well, taking for granted for a second that the U.S. has been adaptively efficient, in some sense, it muddles along throughout all its crises. Why? I mean, this is an issue you and I have discussed on and off from time to time, but if you had to pin down the reasons, why would that be? Is it the size of the government? Is it the Constitution? What is it? Is it I mean, other countries have tried it but failed. So what is it about the United States that has made it able to resist attempts to shut down fully either economic or political competition?
Well, I don't have a good answer to that, but I do have the fact that we have created really an array of organizations. Now, institution and organization are different. Institutions are the rules of the game. Organizations are the structure of groups that build themselves a framework to carry out some project, whether it's a firm or a trade union or whatever. That's organizations. And organizations obviously are always trying to become interest groups in the sense that they can protect themselves from falling apart or failing by creating a degree of monopoly power. But one of the things about this that we still don't really have a good handle on is that in the course of doing that, you created countervailing power within the system so that we prevented any organization from coming to be so dominant that they can throttle the system. Not completely, as witnessed, say, agricultural interest groups in the United States, but well enough so that a dynamic process of competition in political and economic markets has perpetuated itself. And you can get something we haven't talked about, you can get a legal system put in place that tends to provide, not completely, but to a substantial degree, a level playing field amongst all the participants. One of the things about, we haven't talked about this at all, one of the things that is a crucial part of a movement from a limited access to an open access is extending literal real citizenship to a broader and broader percentage of the population. I mean, Thomas Jefferson may have gone and had we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, not women, you understand, men. I'm looking at you. But it was that was ridiculous at the time. But what we did from 1775 on was we gradually extended citizenship to broader and broader groups, not getting women in until 1920, you understand, but getting slaves and so on. And that's a crucial part of it, because as you extended, and this is something we haven't worked out completely in this book, which we're going to do in the next book, as you extend citizenship, you get new interest groups, they restructure the political system, but with enough competition amongst them so that if it works right, nobody gets to have permanent monopoly. I talked long enough for now?
No, I don't think so. Would you like to take a break?
Yeah.
I think we'll take a break for now, and we'll talk some more about this.
I need to drink more wine.
And open up, give Douglas a chance to eat and drink a little bit, give you a chance to take a few minutes break, and maybe we'll resume it.